July 5th, 2013, to pay honor to Frederick Douglass on this anniversary of the reading of his infamous "What to the Negro is the 4th of July." I'll be reading that later on today at the Frederick Douglass Resource Center here in Rochester at 3 o'clock. "What to the Negro is the 4th of July" is one of the most infamous speeches ever written because it was a very challenging and daring speech that my ancestor gave right here in Rochester on this day in 1852, approximately 161 years ago. Frederick Douglass means many things to many people, but for me, as a blood relative, he probably means so much more. What made him so great isn't that he was the only leader of his day, because he was not. Many of my other heroes, the fathers of Pan-Africanism, were running buddies with Frederick Douglass. Martin Delany, who co-edited the North Star newspaper with Frederick. You also have Alexander Crummell, who built the first higher learning institution for black men, the American Negro Academy, was a grandfather of Pan-Africanism and a running mate of Frederick Douglass. You also have Edward Wilmot Blyden, who came to America to study at seminary school but was rejected for being black and ended up in Liberia and ultimately became Secretary of State. You also have probably one of the greatest of them all, and that is the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, who also escaped from slavery to freedom, one county over from Frederick Douglass's county, Talbot in Maryland, and one county over from Harriet Tubman's county, which I believe was Kent. So Douglass, Tubman, and Garnett all escaped from 3 counties that were adjacent to each other in Maryland. How interesting that is. Frederick Douglass' narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And he wrote 3, Narrative of the Life, Life and Times, My Bondage and My Freedom. But it was narrative of the life that was so monumental, not because it was the first slave narrative, because it wasn't. It was the first where the slave named his master and himself, which made Frederick infamous because as an escaped slave, he was still the property of Aaron Anthony, his European master according to American law. So by naming himself, he made it easy for them to find him. So when William Lloyd Garrison of the American Anti-Slavery Society asked him, why would you commit this type of political suicide by naming yourself? And in response, Frederick said, if I did not tell people who I was, if they cannot pinpoint that I was an enslaved African, they wouldn't believe I wrote this book, because black people are not capable of this type of literature according to white folk. So he did it to make sure his narrative wouldn't be passed off as a work of plagiarism written by white folk with a black name, because that was the argument. He didn't write it, prove it. So the first few years of the publication of Narrative of the Life, he had to go around the country proving that he wrote the book. And it was Narrative of the Life that really helped erase the myth that black people were intellectually inferior to white people. Believe it or not, Frederick Douglass, which I'm not surprised of because he was influenced by so many Pan-Africanists, actually considered repatriation of all African people to Haiti. At one point, he said, we got to get the hell up out of here. Frederick. He changed his mind a little bit later, but he never gave up his defense of independent black institutions. People often compare Frederick to Martin Luther King. Similarities, but significant differences, even though they were both aggressive integrationists. Frederick believed in violence. He did not believe in nonviolence. He got his own freedom through violence after beating his slave master. He sent his sons into the Civil War. Now think about this now. You're the leading black of your day. Your sons do not have to go fight in the Civil War because you're a dignitary of your race. He sent them anyway. He said, how can I claim to be about the freedom of black folk and send 180,000 black men to war, but my sons ain't got to go? Because you know, in American government, none of the senators have to send their children to war. But yours go, but theirs don't have to go, and they started the war. Frederick said, I can't be a hypocrite. He sent Lewis and Charles. They fought in the Massachusetts 54th Colored Regiment, from which we get the movie Glory. His brother, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, who I'll be visiting at his grave on Monday because his birthday was July the 1st. So what was that, about 4 days ago? He was born 1819. Frederick was born 1818. Most of our relatives, descendants of the Bailey family who lived in slavery, are buried in a very large, what I want to call it, a very large, I'm going to call it a cemetery. It's a large plot of land in a cemetery that the church that my grandfather Stephen helped build, the Bethel AME Union Church, Talbot County, Maryland, still there. They purchased a large cemetery where many of my ancestors who lived in slavery and in freedom are buried. So I'll be going down there to pay respect to my grandfather Stephen, Frederick's brother, and his wife, my grandmom Caroline, because her birthday was June 26th. So Stephen and Caroline only about a week apart. So for me, it's fortunate to be here today with Frederick, and I'll be with his brother, my direct ancestor, in Maryland on Monday. My family came to America in 1701. First one that we know of, 1701. Black man named Bailey, most likely stolen from the Igbo nation of Nigeria. And the reason we believe it's the Igbo of Nigeria because Grandma Betsy, who raised Frederick and Stephen, was known for being able to talk to plants like George Washington Carver and make them grow. This was my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmom, his grandma. They said she was, when crops wouldn't do well in the neighborhood, they would call Grandma Betsy. She would come and do something and talk to them and pray and make the crops come back. That's something that is unique to African women of the Igbo nation of Nigeria. Also, she was a leader of the enslaved African community. She was a big mama. She was the Yemoja, the queen of the community. That's where Frederick got his leadership from because his grandparents put it in him. She also used to go fishing with her bare hands. That's also unique of Igbo women in Nigeria. Not that others don't do it, but they're particularly known for going into the water with their hands, no fishing net, and catching a fish. Okay? The other interesting thing about our family, well, let me go back to the tree. So 1701, black man named Bailey shows up in Talbot County, Maryland. We don't know if the name Bailey is indigenous African or not. There's debate over that. So Bailey marries a black woman named Selah. My youngest daughter is named Selah. Her birthday was June 23rd. We named her after the queen mother of the family. So Bailey marries Selah. In 1745, they have a daughter named Jenny. In 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, Jenny has a daughter named Betsy. This is the grandmother who would ultimately raise him and teach him to be a leader. Betsy married a free black man named Isaac, who's believed to have been a Moor, an African in America prior to slavery. And the reason some in my family and historians believe him to be a Moor, because there's no record of him nor his parents, from what I understand, of having ever been enslaved. So you have Isaac Bailey, who had the same last name, and that's why some people think Bailey may be indigenous, because Isaac was free, and his name was also Bailey, and Betsy just happened to be Bailey too. So they got married. They had about 13 children. You had a lot of children in slavery because the slave master needed them to work. So Isaac free, but Betsy had to remain a slave. And in most states, the condition of the children followed the condition of the mother. So since Betsy was slave, the children were slave. One of their daughters was named Harriet. That's Frederick's mother. Harriet was raped by Aaron Anthony, who owned our family. Aaron Anthony was the overseer for Colonel Lloyd's plantation. Colonel Lloyd was a big slave master. He had like 400 slaves. Aaron Anthony was his overseer. But Aaron Anthony also had a group of slaves of his own, small little slave stack. Our family was Aaron Anthony's personal slaves. So anyway, Aaron Anthony raped his mother Harriet. And so in February 1818, he was born. You're going to read some history books that's going to say he was born in 1817, 1819. It's wrong. It's 1818. And how do we know this? Not just through family history, but also the slave records has him being born in February 1818. And as far as February 14th being the birth date, I need to double check that, because last time I saw it, they did not know the exact date. But then I'm hearing now that they found February 7th to be the date. So I need to double check on them dates to see if the actual date is in the slave record. And I can check that at home because I have a copy of the slave narrative of the record. So anyway, Aaron Anthony the next year rapes Harriet's sister. So Harriet is Frederick's mom. Her sister is Betsy, named after her mom. The same slave master raped sister 1, sister 2. So in 1819, his brother Stephen is born. When you read his narratives, he talks about cousin Stephen. That's my direct ancestor. But cousin Stephen was not only cousin Stephen, they were found out later that he was also brother Stephen, because the slave master raped both moms. So Frederick, for me, is a great-great-great-great-grand uncle and a great-great-great-great-grand cousin. If I deal with the slave master as dad, he becomes an uncle. If I deal with his mother and my great-great-great-great-grandmother being sisters, he becomes cousin. So I often refer to him interchangeably. And when you study slavery, you're going to find in your history, for those of us who had enslaved Africans in our history, because not all of us did, you'll find a lot of cousin-sibling relationships. He was my cousin and my brother. She was my sister and my cousin because of the rape of multiple sisters in the same blood. So let me go on. So Frederick turns 20 years old and escapes to freedom. Changes the name from Bailey, which is the family name. Most of my relatives still carry that family name. I'm even thinking of changing mine back. To Douglas. This name was suggested to him by white abolitionists. Why? Because under the fugitive slave law, if they find you, you go back to chains. And how do they track you? By your slave master's last name. So he had to drop the Bailey, and he took up Douglas because they thought it would be difficult for them to find him. So he ultimately had to run away to where? England, because the slave master was looking for him. He also had to go to England. Why? Because after the John Brown raid of 1859, the white man who led that raid on the Army Arsenal in West Virginia, Harper's Ferry, Frederick was implicated in that, so they wanted to kill him. So he had to get out of Dodge. He went to England. A group of white women in England raised money for him to buy his freedom. I actually participated in a celebration in England about 2 months ago in honor of Frederick Douglass on February 14th, the alleged birthday, but I joined in by telephone because they just dedicated a house to him over there where he used to live. Now here's the interesting thing. William Lloyd Garrison of the American Anti-Slavery Society got mad at Frederick for allowing the white women to buy his freedom. He said, if you let yourself get bought, you're consenting to the fact that you was a slave. Frederick said, no, I'm not. If I don't let them buy my freedom, I come back to America, I go back to slavery. I'm trying to fight to free my people, so I gotta let them purchase my freedom so I can keep on doing what I'm doing. We find out later that William Lloyd Garrison may have been trying to set him up, because William Lloyd Garrison was jealous of Frederick because he began to do what? Speak for himself. When he escaped from slavery to freedom, he was hired by William Lloyd Garrison to speak for the anti-slavery movement. But William Lloyd, the white man, said only talk about life as a slave. Do not advocate emancipation. That's the job of us intelligent white people, not you. Frederick said, I didn't change one slave master for another. I'm going to advocate my own case. And that's when they split, and it was William Lloyd Garrison, the white man, so-called father of emancipation, who was one of the first people to start spreading rumors that Frederick Douglass was cheating on his wife. Came from his own buddy. So for those of us who think about these benevolent Europeans, dig a little bit deeper into the history. So anyway, Civil War starts. He sends his 2 sons to the Civil War. After the Civil War is over, he pushes for the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, ultimately 15th Amendment, which we all know generally didn't give us what it should have because they played with the language and everything else, okay? But nonetheless, he fought for it. Fought for the right for black women, fought, even helped white women. He was a universal statesman, but he loved his people. And even some black leaders like Ida B. Wells, who was a staunch race woman, began to lose faith in Douglass because they felt he was going too far to the right. And then they had to retract it because they would look at some of the things he did late in his life and say, this man is still the same man he was at 20 that he is in his 70s. The reason Frederick is iconic for everybody is because he defended the right to fight for freedom, but he also defended the right to fight and agitate through the legal instruments available. So whether you a nationalist, Pan-Africanist, Hebrew, Moor, everybody can pull something from the example that he gave us. First significant leader of the 19th century that black people could look to and say, that's what a black man is supposed to be. He only made one mistake, and that was marrying her when he was an old man. Rumor has it that his wife, and I don't know, this is alleged, and I want to make sure I underscore that because she resting here and I don't need no juju coming at me for saying the wrong thing. But it's alleged that she may have told her, because she was the personal assistant, that when she dies, take care of my husband. And some people say that's part of the reason why he decided to marry her, because nobody knew him better, and the wife gave her the blessing to take care of the husband. We don't know. But as a race man, we don't accept. But had he never got with her, I think he would have undisputedly, and for some people he still is, undisputedly the greatest black man to have existed in the last couple hundred years. But had he not got with her, he definitely would have been without question. That's the only stain. But that does not undo the great work that the ancestor did. So let me finish the tree. My grandfather, his brother, Stephen, and his son, George, born to him by Grandmom Caroline, also fought in the Civil War. Frederick's sons was up in Boston fighting, right? Well, they came to the South, but the 54th was recruited in Boston. My grandfather and his son, George and Stephen, father and son, fought side by side with the Maryland 7th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops. One of the most dangerous regiments in the Civil War. In fact, the only one that probably lost more lives was the one that Lewis and Charles participated in, the 54th. After the Civil War, George Washington Bailey marries Annie Wayman. They have a daughter named Caroline Bailey. Caroline Bailey relocates to Philadelphia. She has a daughter named Vivian. Vivian marries a Cuban immigrant named Cicero Noel Miles, my Spanish-speaking great-grandfather. They have my grandmother Ida, who marries James Johnson. They have my father, okay, Alex, but he changes his name to Jamal. Then he and my mother married Umar Johnson. Well, I was Jermaine back then. He changed it to Umar. I was born August 21st, 1974, 11th generation descendant of the first in my family that we know of to be brought here.